of the Vietnam War. Mr. DeCamp.
Exactly 4 years and 1 week ago, I was on another war panel, or panel discussing a war. It was 6,000 miles away. It was over in Paris. We held the panel discussion. There were 20 of us. We held it over a period of 3 days, held it around the same Paris peace talk table in the same room that Henry Kissinger had signed the Paris Peace Accords 15 years before. I was probably the lowliest, if you would, of the participants, because the other people in the group of 20 included Henry Kissinger, Bill Colby, former ambassador and head of the CIA, Ambassador Comer, most of the generals and American officials who had been the leaders of the Vietnam War. When it came my turn to speak, and by the way, the subject of the conference was Rethinking Vietnam. In other words, what went right or wrong, who lost the war really was the essence of it. And when it came my turn to speak, I probably took the shortest time. I said, we did not lose the war. And that's the truth. If you go back and use all the standards that are used to measure success in a war, we had won the Vietnam War. Now, what are those standards? Very simply, did the other guy go back to his side of the line? Did the fighting stop? Did you establish, quote, the government elected by the people? Tad corrupt, admittedly. Did you accomplish these things? And absolutely. In 1972, when the Paris Peace Accords were signed, that was accomplished. I said, but the war was lost because the American people were determined that it wasn't going to be won. And if they didn't approve it in the first place, they weren't going to approve it even later on when it was settled. And that's exactly what occurred. If you go back in your historical time period, it was mentioned earlier by this gentleman. In 1975, April, I believe it was, the Congress, under pressure from the American people, refused to appropriate even $100 or $120 million and allow the B-52 bombers to go back and scare the North Vietnamese one more time. Basically, we wrote them off, so the people threw the thing out. But by the technical standards, we won the war by the way you measure wars. So what's that got to do with anything? Well, as I say, that was a panel I participated in exactly 4 years ago about a war that was. Today, I think this panel is far more critical, far more important, and a lot of panels like it, because it's dealing with a war that will be unless something intervenes fairly rapidly. Now, let me give you some quick background on myself so maybe you understand a little bit more where I'm coming from. To be real frank, normally you wouldn't find me in a crowd like this. That's right. And you probably wouldn't want me most of the time. I was in the Vietnam War. I did my part. I was an Army infantry captain. 21 years ago, I think about exactly, my boss over there gave me permission to do something kind of crazy. And I ran for office from Vietnam. Actually, first, last, and I think it's the only campaign ever run without setting foot in the United States. And I won my senator position from Vietnam. Can't do it anymore. The Army's outlawed it. But anyway, at the time, my boss, a chap named Bill Colby, who at that time was ambassador to Vietnam and secretly was head of the CIA in Vietnam, and later became official head of the CIA, gave me permission to do this. As I say, I won the election, became a state senator, served as a senator for about 16 years in Nebraska. Over that period of time, I guess I'd have to say I carried the Republican banner as well as anybody. In fact, if you go back and check, you'll find I received the most votes of anybody in the state to be the delegate pledged to go to the National Convention and nominate George Bush, and before that, Ronald Reagan. member of the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars. In fact, I'm the state lobbyist now and the state attorney for them. I'm also the state lobbyist and whatever for the disabled American veterans, of which I'm a member. Got all the credentials that say I should wave the flag and say, let's go to war. I can't tell you that, though, because I don't think this war is winnable in any way, shape, or form, because I think it's motivated completely for the wrong reasons. I've talked to a lot of people, not necessarily people that would be in your crowd, but people that might normally be expected to be the first to wave the flag and say, let's go to war. I think generally, even though they may not say it visibly or verbally, they have the perception that the war, and I talk about the war because Mr. Bush says he's going to war effectively, it's a cover-up for other problems. A cover-up for a $347 billion deficit they project next year. A cover-up for an economy in disastrous trouble. A cover-up for a $3 trillion debt that's been accumulated over the last dozen years. In essence, it's a cover-up for all the economic ills and social ills that this country's going through right now. But I see it as something even worse than that. I see it personally. And once upon a time, believe it or not, I lived in the Middle East as a young man, young boy, wandered around, used to speak Farsi, Persian, about as good or better than I spoke English, I think. I see it as the worst of all things. Do you remember during the Vietnam War, there was one phrase that was used more often than anything? They would repeat it when they wanted to say we had made a mistake in Vietnam or what had gone wrong. They'd quote Eisenhower, they'd quote various generals, they'd quote de Gaulle, and that phrase was, America must never allow itself to get involved, remember, in a land war in Asia, because America can't win a, quote, land war in Asia. From a purely military standpoint, tactically, strategically, you could expend all your resources and it just couldn't be won. That's what the general said. Well, let me give you the warning for this one. Don't let America get involved in a religious war in the Middle East. And that's what this one is. It isn't oil. Oil's a cover. It isn't all these other things, jobs. It's a religious war. And one way or another, there are certain entities, Israel, for example, that are determined to get the religious war going. If it doesn't start as a religious war, the very mechanics, the very essence over there of the people will turn it ultimately into a religious war. And the flower of the American youth are going to be used as little more than surrogates, as agents, as hired help, if you would, for the Israeli cause. And that's why I'm so afraid, because on any pretext at all, anybody with any common sense knows somebody over there wants to get it going. And on a moment's notice, that ability to get a war going seems to be able to be done in every clime and time for those who really want it. Now, do I believe Mr. Bush? Do I believe Mr. Bush when he says he wants to get a war going? Do I believe he's telling the truth? Or do I believe he's bluffing? I don't believe he's bluffing. I'll tell you why. Because I think he's a fairly intelligent individual. I make no judgments on a variety of the other things that have been said about him today. I want to deal on a fairly level field here. But he's a fairly intelligent and capable human being. You have to know, you absolutely have to know, that playing in this war, you're dealing literally with the fate of the world. Literally with the fate of the world in the future. No responsible politician, no honest politician, no intelligent politician bluffs on something like that. You bluff when you're dealing with other things. You don't bluff when you're President of the United States and you're dealing with the fate of the world. And so I take him at his word. He says he's going to war. He says he wants a war. And that's why I think it's so dangerous, and in a sense, he's so dangerous. So, I guess my message would be, learn as much as you can, speak out, and don't do what we did in Vietnam. Don't wait until after it started. Don't wait till after we're deep in it, because then it's too late. And so that's one of the main reasons why I came to this group to say, do whatever you have to. Speak out wherever you have to. Sound the alarm, because if you don't, we're dealing with the destruction of this country and a lot of other countries. Anybody that thinks it's going to be a one-day affair such as Panama or anything else is living in a fool's paradise. You want body bags, you may not have to go to Iraq. If I were Saddam Hussein and I were attacked, I wouldn't keep the war over there, would you? If you got gas, you'd drop it on Main Street in New York at rush hour. It can do as much good for you there as it can over in Iraq. And rest assured, he has the ability to get it here. That's the kind of things that can come out of a full-scale war. So having said this, as I say, I hope you'll do whatever you can to do something about it. Now I want to bring up another subject. Why I even came here. Yes, I came here because I feel I have an obligation to speak out and be one of them speaking out. But I also have a debt to pay to some people that I read about in the paper all the time. The crazies. Yeah, you've read about them. The LaRouches. You guys? Huh? Sure. You don't have to go very far. You can pick up any paper and read about you every day. And if you follow the press, you'll know. Hey, you know, they're the crazies, right? How do you know they're the crazies? Well, the proof is there. The guy got locked up. He's in jail. Hell, they're also bandits, see, huh? Well, let me tell you my experience with these folk. A couple years ago in Nebraska, we had some events occur there that started rocking and shaking up the state and causing disturbances. Started out real simple. A financial institution went broke. A chap named Larry King, very big black man, powerful, was in charge of an institution. The day after Bush was elected, they closed down the institution and said that he'd stolen some money. Well, see, I knew Larry. I knew Larry because at each of the national conventions, Larry was the first one standing in the podium to open the convention, singing the national anthem, put on the biggest party that's ever been put on at any national convention, held at a place called South Fork Ranch, for example. You know it as the place where they showed Dallas on the soap opera. I expect we had 5,000 to 10,000 people there. It looked to me to be about $1 million party. And of course, Larry put that on his salary of $16,000 a year that he got at his financial institution. Well, as the things began unfolding, as the tale began to unfold and things started coming out, we started learning that there were all kinds of insane allegations that absolutely could not, should not be true, that are impossible to be true. These allegations, which you may have read about in the Washington Post or New York Times and various stories, involved organized, very large-scale pedophilia, child abuse, Satanism, selling of children, kidnapping of children, actual killing and sacrifice of children, using children in an organized fashion for drug carrying and so on and so forth. About 1.5 years ago, as these reached a crescendo, I was one of the ones that, maybe it's been 2 years now, made the statement that, listen, this is out of hand in terms of making these allegations. Unless you've got a smoking gun, you better not be making these allegations. Well, the legislative committee hired a very prominent investigator and very capable one, and I said, unless you can prove it, either put up or shut up, but quit making the allegations. And I was roundly condemned by some of the people that claimed the child abuse did exist. But they did investigate. They started finding things, shocking things, frightening things. The legislative committee said, hey, we believe it. We've seen it. We've got the documentation. Here, do something, police, do something, law enforcement. But you know, there was one other factor. I guess I didn't mention it. The factor that seemed to strike people's attention in this whole matter was that everybody who was anybody in terms of power and the wealthiest people were the heads of this group. Larry King, the owner of the only statewide newspaper in the state, the multi-millionaire financier of this and that, the chief of police of Omaha, and so on and so forth. And finally, in frustration, when nothing ever seemed to get done, I wrote a memo suggesting that there was a massive cover-up. They formed some grand juries. The grand juries issued their report. They said all this is a hoax. I'm making a long story short and being very careful in what I say, and I'd love to tell you the whole story if I had the time, but I'm also under an official gag order where I can't officially say anything because I'm now representing some of the people involved in the case, some of the children who have now been charged, the victims have been charged with crimes. But anyway, as they investigated, as I say, the grand jury came up with their conclusion. Their conclusion was this is all a hoax perpetrated by these children. Independently, disorganized, but they have created this incredible story that's all a hoax. Even us good Nebraskans had a few doubts. Opinion polls conducted by the radio, because the newspaper, remember, is the only one statewide and they control everything, showed that in the first grand jury, 72% of the people didn't believe the grand jury. When the second grand jury came down a couple months later saying the same thing, 91% of the population said, hey, we know better. Why did they know better? Because they had the information themselves. In frustration, and now we get to the reason why I owe a debt. In frustration, I did something kind of insane. I talked to a LaRouche. And I said, hey, I don't care if you're Satan himself from the left or the right. We need somebody in here to start looking at things, somebody that isn't completely controlled by a limited power structure that can create whatever truth they want, that can falsify things, that can control grand juries, that can literally take over institutions of government and use them for their own political purposes. And so the Schiller Institute organized a human rights group from a dozen different states and nations. And the people came from Germany, from Finland, from Canada, from I don't know where all. And I gave them one message, the same one they've stuck back to me on something else I'll talk about in a minute. That message was this. You check. You go talk to the people. You ask the questions. You find out the truth. And if the kids are lying, be the first to step up bold and big and say, the little rats are lying. It is a hoax, just like the grand jury said. But for God's sake, if you find out they're telling the truth, if you find out it is a cover-up, if you find out it's exactly what's being claimed, then have the intestinal fortitude, have the courage to stand up and say it. People like Reverend Bevel, who I've come to know since then, came and did their investigation, spent about 10 days there. People, as I say, from all over the United States and different countries. And they issued a report. And they said, this is the most awesome, frightening thing we've ever seen. It isn't just Nebraska. Oh, I didn't mention at the convention, part of the story is Larry takes children there to use for various purposes at the convention, national conventions, things like that. So it zips right on up into the highest ranks of the Republican Party, which makes you wonder, it isn't maybe coincidental that the things get covered up. But they issued their report. They issued their report, and they basically were even more firm, I think, and stronger in their conclusions than I was. What happened to their report? Well, the controlled press in the state simply said, these people are all crazy too. All part of a hoax too. And so that's about where it sits now, except the grand jury did one other thing. They decided they had to indict the children witnesses, the kids who had been the victims of this over a period of 8 or 10 years. And at that point, as I say, I stepped in and agreed to defend And remember, in this entire process, the one key to cover-up, and I call it a cover-up openly and publicly. Oh, one other little factor in there. The investigator, I didn't mention this. The investigator, one of the most capable and honest individuals I've ever run across, that the legislative committee said was the best and most honest person they'd ever dealt with. These are the senators themselves, who are scared beanless now. They blew him up, somebody blew him up in the air with his little boy in an airplane and killed him. Accident, of course. They haven't found the cause yet, but anyway, they came, they investigated. They're trying to do something about it. They see the same thing. Institutions of government being taken over by limited groups or individuals who have incredible power and wealth and use institutions of government for their own purposes. In other words, suppress and take over the political process. So when they did theirs, they asked me to do something. They said, you know, yeah, we hear Lyndon's crazy and so on, but we just ask you, you're a lawyer, you check out the actual records. Independently, you go do the same thing you asked us to do. You check the records on the LaRouche trial. You see as a lawyer, did he get a fair shake? I took the time. I spent months doing it. I've read the records. And I make no judgments personally with all state here at this time whether Lyndon LaRouche is God himself or Satan himself. I expect, like everything, truth is somewhere in the middle. I think he's a genius for sure. Whether everything he says is right or whatever, as I say, I don't know. I do know this. By everything that's holy, by everything in our Constitution, by every measure you want to use of our judicial system, there is no more classic case of institutions of government being taken over so that you can accomplish a political purpose, which is eliminating your political competition. He was railroaded by every way, shape, and form you want to judge. If he were Hitler, and I read the same documents and saw the same records, I would be compelled to say the same thing. If he were Jesus Christ, the same records, the same standards, the same Constitution, you'd have to say exactly the same thing. Now, why does this bother me? Because it is the very essence of our country that it's the rule of law instead of the rule of men. And so whether it's my situation, our situation in Nebraska, that goes way beyond the borders, goes into Washington itself, where individuals have literally taken over and now own the institutions of government and use them for their own purposes, to cover up their sins, to commit child abuse. Whether it's that, or whether it's a Lyndon LaRouche, the point is, it's a threat to all of us. If they can do it to him, or they can do it in Nebraska, then they can do it anywhere. And that's the danger of this whole thing on the Gulf. Because the man has said, I'm going to war, and I don't care what you want. And when they have that kind of power, and it's been demonstrated, whether it be the LaRouche case or the situation going on there now, that they're willing to take over institutions of government, then fellas and ladies and gentlemen, we're in serious shape. And I'm not sure what the outcome is, but I think people like myself, people like you, have to stand up and be counted and do what we have to. The case in Nebraska is going to get serious. As I say, I wish I could tell you one wealth of information more, but the whole key, like so many things, is suppression of information, keeping secrecy. That's why they put a gag order on me. So I can't supposedly talk about it. They use secret testimony in the grand jury, secret testimony before committees, because you can't say anything. They all threatened to sue me for libel. I've begged them to. I publicly said, come on down, I'm ready. Sue me. At least then we'll have the shot in the open courts. And eventually that's what has to happen there, and has to happen in the LaRouche case and a lot of other things. It has to get out in the open. The public has to share the information. Otherwise, truth becomes whatever those who control the institutions of government say it is. I picked up this paper, and I read something in the corner of it. And boy, did it really have meaning for me after what I've been through and watched the last couple of years. It says, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freedom of speech. And if you ever wanted the textbook example of how it can be done, come to Nebraska. Watch how, when you totally control the press, you own the press, and you're also the sinners, you can make truth whatever you want. You can make villains out of heroes. You can make sinners out of saints, and vice versa. Well, I've talked way too long, far shorter than my other friends, but I promised only 20 minutes and an open commitment here under pain of death and everything else. I did want you to know about the Nebraska situation. I did want to simply say, you better do something that you can about the war, because you're going to find this country simply being used as the tools for somebody else's religious war, and I ain't about to participate a second time. Thank you.
Whoever gave me these things better explain them, because I'm not going to read them. They're obscure to me. I want to particularly thank Mr. DeCamp for bringing up a subject dear to my heart, which is that all of you should subscribe to this newspaper. Seriously, it's the only way